numbers of people who are joining is creeping up, so I'll make a start. So, hello and thank you for joining us, iAdmin 2026. In this session, your presenter is Larry Bullhouse, IBMI champion since 2019. Larry has many years of experience, but don't worry, buddy, I'm not going to tell them how many. Just lots, just lots.
Still lots.
Um, in this session, Larry's going to cover planning a smooth move of your IBMI into the cloud. We all know that using the cloud can be a great option for IBMI. And in today's session, Larry's going to give a comprehensive overview of the reasons and processes for moving to the cloud. If you have any questions for the presenter throughout the session, please put them in the Q&A tab on the right-hand side, and we'll go through as many as we can at the end of the session. Larry will also try and cover these off as we're going through. If we don't get to your question, then we are going to keep a list of all of those questions, and we'll go through it in the live Q&A at the end of day 2. Any other comments, please use the chat function, and yeah, we'll pick those up there too. Over to you, Larry.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I've been around long enough that when we talked about cloud, it usually meant either the sun was hidden a bit or there was rain. That was all you got from clouds. Not today. So I always like to start with a why we're here slide. And in this case, utilizing the cloud is often a great option for IBMI customers. And while it sounds simple and it is at its core, there's a lot to consider. There really is. It sounds really, really simple sometimes. Hey, we'll just move to the cloud. How many times have you heard that from management or a board of directors or something, right? But there's also options. How do you get there? And we need to look at a lot of these things to find out what's the best fit for your organization. And frankly, does it fit? Because I don't believe that cloud is for everybody. All right, so here's our agenda. I'm not going to read through this, but these are the bullet points that we're going to work our way through through this presentation. So why would I move my IBMI to the cloud? Well, there's some cost issues. I put that first because that's pretty much what everybody starts with, right? Can I save money by moving to the cloud? Well, one of the ways is you can buy only what you need. And if you look at today's Power 11 processors, I did the math a while back of how many IBMI or how many AS400 B10s is the equivalent of one Power 11 core. And the correct answer is, I think, all of them. It's incredible, right? So many of your organizations today don't need a whole core even, right? So you can buy what you need. You can scale at any time when your company does an acquisition or you add a new application, and you can buy those fractional units. If you buy a machine from IBM, you can only buy whole units of processor. You can free up data center space. And of course, the power consumption that comes with that, the cooling load that comes with that. In some cases, you can leave your own data center completely. We had one customer that moved into our cloud and turned the old data center into a wonderful conference room. It really ended up being very nice for them. And they didn't need that big space anymore. And of course, steady, predictable spend. That's another thing because now it goes on the OpEx side versus the CapEx side. So that can help sometimes with your accountants as well. And you look at the staffing side. So very often, IBMI, reliable operating system, boy, that thing can lull you to sleep though, because you just kind of keep doing your regular job, and you really weren't paying attention. And then weeks, maybe months later, oh, we didn't look at this. How about delegating that off to your cloud provider so it's not even on your list anymore? And things like 24-hour support, right? Our organization, for example, has people around the globe that can watch your system 24 hours a day. You, on the other hand, probably like some pillow time, maybe some TV time, some outdoor time, whatever it is that your hobbies are. So, and then of course, physical system work, things like hardware upgrades and maintenance tasks handled by the cloud provider. So when it's time for an upgrade, cloud provider does that instead of having to come into your site and put new things in the rack. So upgrades, here's another one. We had Steve Will talking about, at the end of his presentation, he was going through the roadmap IBMI pretty much every 3 years. He didn't say that, but you could look at his roadmap, right? Every 3 years, a new IBMI. And pretty much on the same cadence, right? Bill Starkey and the power team come out with a new chip, then they come out with a new server. So you've got those hardware upgrades and those software upgrades done by experts at your provider. Instead of you needing to learn how to do the next release upgrade because there's changes, especially in things like security. Are you up to speed on those, or are you going to run into those roadmaps? Do you really need to study the memo to users every time to get that upgrade correct? Higher level of redundancy is another big one. Cloud providers almost universally are going to provide more redundancy than the customer computer room. And I say that not because I'm picking on cloud providers, but because there are some customers out there that really did do a great job in setting up redundancy in their computer rooms. Um, we've got customers that have data feeds from both ends of the building, that have multiple power feeds, multiple generators. Not many of you are at that level of redundancy, but almost all cloud providers are. And that includes redundant staffing. If you've got one admin and that admin is smart enough to take a cruise where there's no cell signal, smart person, right? But you've got to back that person up. Your cloud provider takes care of that for you. So let's look at services that cloud providers bring to the table. So there's monitoring, and we simply don't do servers in our cloud anymore without monitoring on them. And that's beyond all of the basic monitoring. So your servers, the routers, your power, all of that stuff. But we keep right on digging into the power system itself and to your IBMI all the way to QSysOper and so many more things that are going on inside your machine. So the theory here is increase your pillow time. I mean, as Tom mentioned, I've been in this business for some minutes, and there was definitely times in my career where there was a pager laying next to my bed, and that thing would go up. You remember what a pager is? That thing would go off, and it would say something on it, and I would grumble, and I'd get up and typically dial in with a modem, right? But we would get in and we would have to fix those things. Now those things are handled by your provider. And even without managed services, problems are typically identified quickly if there's anything with systems at a systems level. And then for management, cloud providers taking over your entire system management completely. No more worries about finding a new system administrator. There's a lot of people out there in the industry right now, what I like to refer to as with my hair color. And there's a fair number of those that are saying, hey, it's been a great ride. Let's do something else. Or they get a job with someone else. So now you're letting your cloud provider handle that for you instead of requiring that you go out and find another talented individual. Other services, replication. Almost universally, again, cloud vendors have the ability to replicate data in multiple ways from one server to another. Steve mentioned in his presentation that more and more customers have HA now, and that's a good thing. But do you test it? Do you trust it? Do you really do it? We have a lot of customers that I'm aware of where the customer says, yes, we have mimics. We checked the box on a report someplace that said, we got HA. Do you have enough guts to flip over and run it one week every month, say, or maybe a week every quarter? Right. And so those things are, are key. Most vendors will work with mimics. That's the big name, of course, in the software replication business. Then there's hardware replication. At the SAN level, or if you have Power HA GeoMirror, which is internal IBMI replication. And then from a DR perspective, virtual tape. For example, in our cloud, the only thing we use physical tapes for is imports. We don't do backups to physical tapes. It's all done to VTL. And once you get to a virtual tape library, now you can replicate that tape offsite as soon as the backup's done, right? Instantly. So now you still have it on site and you have it offsite, right? So in the case of an emergency, you could restore it in another location. We talked a little bit about upgrades. You mentioned this. The cloud vendor is going to do any of their own hardware, right? Whether that's installing additional capacity, whether that's upgrading current capacity. So that's completely off your plate. Again, the physical space, the cable, the power, cooling, all that off your table, off your plate. But also IBM upgrades and done repeatedly by experts that have done, many and will do many more. And then things from like PTFs. When you don't do these things a lot, it's like, where do I get those PTFs again? What was that site? Oh, Fix Central. What's my download method? Right. There's a lot going on there. And that includes, not just getting the media, but getting the PTFs. PTFs. Yeah, they come from Fix Central, but media comes from what? All right, entitled system support, right? So different location, and then there's keys, right? So all of that vendor handles that. You're done, right? So another thing that another service your cloud vendor should provide. And let's talk a little bit about PTFs. If you missed this memo, IBM now calls them fix information. Okay, it's still going to be PTFs in the OS forever because they're not going to rename that stuff. But out on the web, they call it fix information, and the old APARs have become known issues. Go ahead and Google that. So it wouldn't be right if your vendor couldn't also handle those things, provided, of course, putting all of that on the system and keeping your system up to date. Again, cloud, it's table stakes, right? If your vendor can't do PTFs, then they're probably not truly an IBM cloud. And, the SWAMA is required, but that SWAMA is covered by the cloud vendor again. So, all right, let's look at items to consider for the migration. So you've got your system in one location, you want to put it in another location. Just as an example, I had a customer at one point that put their system on a truck in Michigan, sent it to Wisconsin, and plugged it in. Did everything work? Yes. What needed to change? The IP address. Other than that, people were good to go. So, if you've used DNS for your naming, so that's how your users and your other servers connect to your system through a DNS, a fully qualified domain name, it's going to be pretty simple. Your new LPAR up in the cloud gets an IP address. You change your DNS. Life is good. If you didn't use DNS, that's going to be a little tougher. We have some tricks that we can use to help you identify those devices not using DNS. But that's going to be a thing you have to consider. The system gets a new address. From a time to solve issue, connectivity is really going to be the biggest one. We can change IP addresses in the system in a matter of minutes, right? But how are you going to get that connectivity from your facility or facilities up to your cloud vendor? And that planning is critical, and it needs to be done well. Importantly, a single point of failure just can't happen, right? We know the words that come out of people's mouths. They don't say, hey, the network's down, so I can't get to IBM. No, they say the system is down. Even though the system is happily sitting there humming away, the fact that you can't get there to the user means the system is down. Backups. Cloud vendors typically don't use physical tapes. We don't. They use VTLs. Now, the good news is, from an operating system perspective, most of the VTLs, there are some exceptions, but most of the VTLs and the ones we use just look like IBM tape libraries. So you're cool. BRMS recognizes them and handles them just like a regular library. VTLs are generally faster, and they Importantly, they provide the ability to deduplicate data, so you can save a lot of tapes in the same space. And the key is replicate offsite. We mentioned that virtually all our customers, when they back up to the VTL, it gets replicated to another one of our sites. And then there's other things like flash copy and remote copy. Those are options as well. Flash copy gets you the ability to snapshot the data and take a backup of that so that your users aren't down during the backup. So very cool capability there. When we talk about connectivity, for small companies, the options are fewer because they don't want to invest a ton of money in that. And so it's typically things like IPsec, so a VPN across the internet using IPsec protocols. And then I'll also consider IBMI doesn't stand alone anymore. When I started in this industry, customers had a computer, and it might be a 34 or a 36, then an AS400. Some people started to get a PC. Today, there's all sorts of things, and they're not necessarily in the same cabinet or the cabinet next door. They may be in another cloud. They may be in AWS or Azure, Google. How are you going to connect to these, right? So you have to, when you move to a cloud, you have to consider those other servers. Where are they? Will they move with your IBMI to the same cloud? Typically an option. Or are they somewhere what I refer to as far, far away, and you still need to communicate with them? So got to think about that too. Redundancy, how redundant do you want to be? As we mentioned, the cloud providers are generally more redundant than private companies, okay? Silly things like RAID and RAID 5 off the table, right? Voted that off the island sometime back. Everything is either mirrored or RAID 6 and with distributed hot spare and all of that. So much, much higher redundancy level there. But, what happens if the poorly driven truck or the poorly flown airplane slams into your building? Okay, so that's a problem. And of course, that network connectivity, right? We don't hear network is down, we hear system is down. So this connectivity comes up here again because it is a super high priority for your implementation. So let's look at connection options because this is a biggie. Well, internet, and what I generally mean here is just open ports to the internet. So where you might have port 443 open for a web server, port 992 open for telnet, et cetera, et cetera. But even if you have TLS on all of those, there's still exposures there. Some protocols just suck over these connections. And if you have open ports and you provide green screen, for example, on that port 992, somebody could come in and try to log in as QSEC offer, right? Disable QSEC offer. Is that a problem? For some companies it is. For many companies it's not. The old days of just leaving that wide open, that's just not a thing. We do have a couple demo systems that we use on the internet, and hilariously, we created the root user profile. We gave it a great big 128 character password, but we did that just to see how many times people try to log in as root. And over a course of a year, it's millions. So bad idea, really. IPsec tunnels, these are really the go-to for the smaller customer because most people have a firewall already on site. Even the small customers, not all of them, but most, have the ability to do an IPsec tunnel. And so now you can do a VPN between sites. It's going to be secure, right? It's low cost because it's built into your appliance and built into the equipment we have. Sufficient bandwidth is important, but remember, basic green screen, if you're still running an app that's green screen, the bandwidth need is very low, very low. Back in the day, we ran 9600 baud multi-point lines with half a dozen terminals and a couple printers on. Was it amazing performance? No, but it worked. So that kind of gives you a picture of for green screen applications. Start going to web, start adding images and all that, and it goes up. But still, you're not moving the database back and forth across that link. So you probably don't need a 10 gig link in most cases. Now let's look at the connection configuration. Quite often, and I get involved in a fair number of these conversations, the customer calls up and says, yeah, well, we've got corporate headquarters and our main distribution center, and then we've got 3 other locations or 4 other locations, and they already connect to corporate. So we're just going to connect corporate over to your data center. Simple, one connection, everybody rides that connection. Well, that sounds great and it's simple to implement, but what happens if corporate is the location that goes down? And maybe corporate is absolutely up and running, but there's this thing that we know in the industry referred to as backhoe fade. And that's where you find 2 or 3 guys in a very large piece of yellow equipment, and they're staring in a hole, and there's a broken fiber down there. Now what do you do? Right? Corporate's down, but because corporate's down, so is everybody else. So we tend to prefer the diagram on the right, where the service provider has a direct connection to all of the locations. This way, a single failure doesn't take down everybody all at once. Okay. And these individual IPsec connections are very low cost, approaching free. Nothing is free, but very low cost because all we're doing is configuring these things on the firewalls. So definitely want to look at that to prevent backhoe fade from biting you. And if you don't believe in backhoe fade, you just haven't been in the industry long enough. Then there's direct private links. So customers that have, requirement for faster bandwidth, lower latency, or they want to have the higher level of security. We have customers with 3 different 10 gig links coming into different sites from different providers, all coming from different cities. So they've really gone out and done their homework and said, this is what we need to make sure that we can do business. Okay. So all the way to the point of a switch failure, even in our facility, because of course we don't connect those links to the same switches. So you can really get higher throughput that way and definitely higher resiliency. And it really comes down to insurance. It's how much resiliency does your company require? Some cases, still pretty small. Customers say, I could be down for a half an hour. Okay. Other customers go, I can't be down for half a minute. Right. So definitely an option for those higher end. Now, MPLS is a virtual switching network, which generally does run over the internet. Typically, a router lands in each site, but the beauty of those is it's very easy to simply add your service provider as a node on that network. Ship them a router, it gets an external IP address, and now the service provider is integrated as part of your network. And so, and then depending on your needs, again, you could have your own circuit brought in to connect to that router as well. So lots of flexibility there. And we have, for example, a rack with these things mounted in them because they're provided by the customer to give them their network. And of course, no matter what choice is made, consider good old backhoe fade. A single link can fail. Redundant providers for any connectivity may be a necessity for your business. And what is that connectivity? We've got a customer in Texas, for example, where their primary is a fiber, but their backup, because they're a farmer's elevator, is an antenna way up on top of the elevator, and it shoots off to some farmer's silo, I believe, but it's a backup link. They have it, right? And importantly, talk to your provider about where they run that last mile. Literally, our corporate office in Grand Rapids, before it was ours, it was one of our customers. They chose 2 different providers that used the exact same last mile. I know exactly where the switch building is, and I know the routing because there's a road and a pond, and about 20 feet between them, all the cables go that way. But one provider came out the other end of the building. They didn't select that one though, because it was more money. So sure enough, Mr. Backhoe shows up and took out both the primary and the redundant links because they chose poorly, right? So um, you really, sometimes you can't avoid that, but it's definitely something you have to ask your provider when you're getting that second quote for that second link. See what you can do to make sure that they're not on the same bundle of cable. All right, let's go. How do I get to the cloud? Well, the gold standard, right? Tape. We've had tape since, well, the 36 actually had options for tape drives. The beginning of the AS400, we had, reel-to-reel tapes. And nowadays, most of y'all will have LTO tapes. Pretty much the only remaining supported option is LTO. It's well known, it's reliable. Although I said that once and Debbie was walking by. If you don't know Debbie Saugin, BRMS is actually backup and recovery by Ms. Saugin. I think that's how that goes. Anyway, she laughed and says, "Wait a minute, you've never had a backup failure?" Yes, backup failures do occur, but this is a well-known process. And if you have a good tape drive and you keep the tapes, don't run them too long, keep your tape drive clean, right? We can take that tape, send it to a cloud provider, have the cloud provider restore it. Okay, that's awesome. But one of the issues with that is if you're going to use that as your move to the cloud, how long does it take from the time you bring the system down for the backup, do the backup, ship the backup, we receive it, we restore it, you do some testing? That could be days, and your business maybe doesn't support being down for days. So then you got to start layering in other things. Another option is VTL replication. If you already have a VTL, maybe you replicate your VTL to us, right? We do a backup, replicate it to us. You keep working, right? Because of deduplication, you can vastly reduce the amount of data being transmitted. And, distance still matters because of latency and such. But the beauty of it is, as soon as that backup is done, replication begins instantly. Whereas back to the tape, you got to wait till FedEx is ready to leave or UPS. I mean, and yes, you could use a courier. We've had customers do that. But with the VTL, doesn't matter what time of day or night. As soon as that backup's done, the data is replicating instantly. So much faster that way. Then there's things like software replication. And this is also very good option. For example, pick Mimics. There's a lot of choices there, but you pick Mimics and you say, well, we establish us as an HA location. You replicate the data when the data is all in sync. If you're familiar with Mimics, you know that Mimics has the ability to pause replication and allow you to do a virtual test, right? It's a virtual failover. So make sure everything is there, everything is working. Is there anything you got to update? Typical things are vendor software keys, for example. And then when it's all good and your testing is happy, resume replication, let it catch back up. And now when it's time to move to the cloud, it's a role swap. Okay. Role swap. Now the cloud site becomes production and your site becomes HA at that moment. And at that point in time, you could decide that you want to keep your location as an HA. Or you could say, nope, my point was to go 100% cloud. Right? So options there as well. So another option is hardware replication. Have a SAN on your location, replicate to a SAN at your cloud provider's location. You could also do that with PowerHA GeoMirror, which is truly actually software replication, but it's built into the PowerHA product. SAN replication, there's no licensing for that anymore. That's all included in your SAN cost. We do have that limitation of pretty much of one IP partner, and some of you are going to say, no, 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 I've seen in my SAN I can do multiple partners now. Yes, kind of. So we're not going to get into that, but it's more nuanced than that. SAN replication is more sensitive to latency because the SANs are moving blocks of data rather than like a Mimix or an Itera. They're moving journal entries, right? So that all that software stuff can be very bursty, and it doesn't care very much. Question in the chat is, how do you decide? Good question. And a lot of times it comes down to there's factors involved. How much data do you have? That's huge. If you have a very large amount of data, tape can work because one tape holds a lot. What's your tolerance for being down during the migration? If you have a very small window and you gotta be back up and running, then you're going to look at, we probably have to focus now on software replication or hardware replication. And then also have to look at, what do you do today? If you're already a Mimix customer, for example, then Mimix is a pretty good choice because you're already set up and using it. If you're not a software replication customer, then that's a thing that has to be selected. But we're not out of options yet, because a couple of others, and these are really far apart if you want to look at them that way. FTP, really? Some of you are saying, Larry, I'm going to FTP my system to your cloud. As a matter of fact, we have one vendor we work with that they typically deal with very small customers. And these very small customers have very small data sets. Okay. Well, we've actually set up a process with them, because they have a bunch of them, where we create an image catalog, optical image catalog. We do a save to that thing. And then we FTP the image catalog up to a partition we have set up to host those guys. And then we restore from that directly to their new LPAR in the cloud. So for a small customer, it's a doable thing. Some of you are going, no way, I'd need twice as much disk. Well, right. But if you remember, especially in the hardware days, disks are only available in certain sizes. There's a lot of small systems out there that are running 15, 20% full because they had to buy enough drives to get a RAID set. And some of you are going, you can't even dream of a system that small. Fair enough. So that's an option for the very small. Now, the coolest one, and Steve mentioned this in his presentation, if you attended his keynote, is migrate while active. And what's kind of interesting about this one is they stole DB2 mirror. Well, they didn't steal it. It's their stuff. Okay. So they repurposed some DB2 mirror code, but instead of the super high, rocky adapters so that you can keep your data within, milliseconds or nanoseconds of exactly the same, they said, well, let's just use all that logic, but let it run over the network. So now in your cloud provider, you set up a new LPAR and you make it a pair with DB2 mirror. You can use a tape if you want for the initial catch-up, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with Mimix, you can do that with Mimix too, and I think the other software products. Then DB2 mirror syncs everything up until it's in sync. Just like a Mimix, you have that test option where you can, stop the replication, do the testing, check it all out, then go back to live, let it resync. And then in the end, essentially you reverse replication. Now, this one is not an HA product. Don't think you could replace Mimix with this, because it's one way. You don't get to reverse it and then potentially use your site as an HA site. It's one way, but it's all built into the OS. And as long as you have 7.4 or newer, and that's actually the one they started at, by the way, they didn't start at 7.6, they started at 7.4. And it's licensed per processor on the source machine. So you license it for 90-day chunks. 90 days may very well be long enough for you to do a migration. There is only a teeny tiny little grace period that's virtually never going to be enough for you to use the grace period for a migration. And they did that on purpose because they know how many customers think. But there's no need for Rocky adapters, no need for super fast networks here. So this is a pretty cool one because it allows you to migrate. And in fact, you could migrate from a 7.4 system at your site, for example, to a 7.5 system in the cloud. So you can accomplish an upgrade, on the fly. So you get the whole partition migrated in this manner over a network, and your outage time for the migration here is very minimal. Is one of the advantages here. Is very minimal migration time in the deal. A couple other questions. Yep. Migrate while active. We just talked about that. Migration guideline for data size. We don't really have a guideline, but we do definitely, as we talk to the customers, we look at what volume they have, how far away is it, what's the amount of data that's changing, right? Because if you take let's say you did a migrate while active again, and you said, well, I've got 5 terabytes of data. Do you want to replicate 5 terabytes of data? I'm going to go no, probably not. But if I can send a tape that's got all those terabytes on it, and then just let DB2 Mirror catch up the changes because you only change, 50 to 100 gigabytes a month, well, no problem. So those are the kinds of questions that you asked. And definitely, no matter where you are, if you're using a network to connect, latency is the big guy, right? You can have a great big huge pipe, but if your latency is large, that will dramatically slow down the throughput, right? All right. Now, let's talk about validating. So you've got to the cloud, you think, and you're in your test phase. What should you look at? Well, there's all the basic things to start with, okay? Can I telnet to the system, assuming you're using green screen? And not all of you do. We recognize that, but your admin, if you have one, still, telnet probably there. Do your printers print? And this can be funny. We had one not very long ago where the customer had a fairly new printer in their office. They were moving from an on-prem IBM that sat in the same network, and that printer printed, but when they moved to the cloud, that printer would not print. The writer wouldn't start, nothing. And, they were adamant that there could not possibly be anything wrong on their side. Right. Until we had somebody share their screen, go into the config page on the printer, and the printer didn't have a gateway established because on their site, it didn't matter. Everything was on the same network. As soon as you're talking to the cloud, that printer without a gateway couldn't talk to us. So simple thing to fix. Yep. But you want to test those things before it's Monday morning and the president didn't get his report. Wait, does the president still get paper reports? It was probably a PDF. But anyway, somebody needed something, right? Do you have file shares? Not the root, of course. You can't share the root over the internet. Yeah, that's a good rule. Actually, you just should never share the root ever. But do you test those shares, right? Make sure that stuff works. Do you use Kerberos or single sign-on? That stuff's got to work. Do you use FTP or SSH, SCP, all of those other things, right? And then your backup connection, right? Because you got 2, you got another connection. So you got to intentionally take down your primary connection and make sure the backup connection works for all these same kinds of things. And whatever those are, make sure you have a plan for testing all of that stuff. Now, what about the data? So you've saved all this data and you restored it in a cloud, or you migrated it with a migrate while active or whatever tool, But how do you know that your data is all there? We tend to say, look, I did a save and I did a restore. It must be all there. Okay. But maybe you should do some active things. Maybe you take a total of data column. Maybe you check some data columns. Maybe you just say, well, if I check the active record count and the table size, it had 1.2 million and 6 rows. Now it's got 1.2 million and 6 rows. Okay. So that's, maybe that's a thing. Maybe that works for you. It is IBMI. Restores are pretty reliable in that if they fail, they tell you. Okay. So, but some things like that, big basic block things, right? Then how about in your application? So back in the day when I was a data processing manager, there were things we ran every month then, right? And we knew that open payables was going to be within a certain amount. And my boss, who was the controller, could say open payables will be and give me a number. Okay. Open receivables, give me a number. Maybe you run an inventory valuation, but you run key reports that your organization knows and says, I ran it before and I ran it after, and those numbers are exactly right. So these are things that increase your comfort level and knowing that everything's there. It also is showing that the reports run and all of that sort of thing is going on. So good tools to use to validate your cloud implementation. Now, what can be a little bit of a challenge is, test the connectivity from other stuff. Whether it's, we mentioned some servers that might be in Amazon or Google or wherever. Test those things, and some of those undocumented connections. Oops. And this is another one where even on your own site, when you're preparing to move to the cloud, we've got some tricks that we use to say, let's help identify those connections that you didn't. And there's ways to do that. We had one customer, for example, they moved into our cloud. Unfortunately, they moved into the cloud as an archive solution. They'd moved off the IBMI platform, but they needed this thing running for some years. And then they said, we don't need backups. Nope, don't need any backups. Nope, we're not changing any data. No data will change. No backups are required. So after probably about 2 months, just for grins, I ran a save changed objects. And it backed up a lot of stuff. So I called them back and I said, hey guys, these tables are all changing. What? So we started looking at connections, and sure enough, they had some old Windows servers and other servers that connected with DNS, fully qualified domain name. So they happily connected to this old system, and they were updating data there. And all of a sudden they went, wait, that's why our numbers don't work. We're not getting the updates to the new ERP. So they identified some problems in their own process that way. It turns out in their case, the cloud migration worked so well, it proved to them they had other problems. So you really need to make sure that those things are watched, right? And we have another question about, various PDI stats, right? So if you're familiar with PDI, Performance Data Investigator, that's another piece. For the very small customer, they can't spell PDI if you spot them the PD and the I, because it doesn't matter to them. They are mostly involved in, look, I got on, I ran a transaction, it worked at the speed of human fingers. The bigger customers, though, where there's a lot of transactions going on, what Performance Data Investigator can tell you is how much CPU am I using, how much IO am I using, how much memory am I using it efficiently, and will my performance be the same or better as I move to a cloud implementation versus my on-prem machine? And there are experts in the industry that can help with that. And that's a good thing to know, because if you are moving into a cloud as a larger enterprise, you don't want to slow down. You really don't. So valid question there. is to get those benchmarks. And PDI can do a tremendous job of doing that. At one point, for example, one of the common systems that I support, we migrated that system from spinning disks to SAN-based solid state. And Dawn May, who's one of our very frequent common presenters, said, "Hey, Larry, what'd you change?" She had this graph with a IO, great big IO, tiny little IO. Like, ooh, yeah, told her. So then tools can help tremendously to get you that validation that your performance is good. So a little wrap up here. It is in fact possible, even logical, to move IBMI to the cloud. I will warn you to never ever move your IBMI to a cloud that can't spell I. Literally, we have heard of power systems laying on the floor because they couldn't figure out how to get the rack rails to snap into a square hole rack. Now that's extreme, but it's true. And if they don't know the operating system, they don't know what an HMC is, they don't have any of those skills, that is not the home for your IBMI. You definitely want somebody who has strong IBMI skills, or if you're an AIX shop, an AIX skills, right? As with so many things, having no plan is planning to fail. Now, we've had some successful migrations. In fact, in our UK location, they did one just last week, 2 days. Why do you do a migration in 2 days? Because something died, right? We've had them 2 days. Customer calls us up. This broke. What are my solutions? Well, do you have maintenance? No. Oh, right. We put them in the cloud in 2 days. They were thrilled. That's not normal, right? And these are small customers. Clearly, one size does not fit all. Some customers, yes, they want to be in cloud, but they really kind of want private cloud. They want their own equipment. They just don't want it in their facility, and they don't want to have to maintain it. Perfect. Does your cloud provider support that? That can be a valid option. Other customers, I don't ever want to think about this owning a piece of hardware again. I don't want to pay SWAMA. I don't want any of that. I only need this tiny little slice. Please sell that. Okay. Some clouds do that much better than others. And cloud doesn't fit every customer. If you're a really, really large customer with a bunch full of cores and petabytes worth of data, you probably won't slide quickly into just any cloud because that's a very large system. And most cloud providers aren't going to have the capacity to give you that variable CPU and all of that along with all their other customers, because most statistically IBMI customers are in the P10 software tier. So if you're that guy with 40 cores running, you're not in P10 software tier. You're on a much bigger machine. So could your cloud provider handle it? Talk to your provider. Maybe they can. But there's also other rules. We see this quite a lot with companies, especially when you get into governments. Our data must stay in a particular geographic location. Has to stay in Canada, has to stay in the US, has to stay in the UK. We even see rules in some cases where, hey, our data, only people in the UK can work on our stuff. Nobody outside of that geographic boundary can work on it. So you have to consider those things as well when you're dealing with cloud. So you got to check all the boxes, right, before you can sign up with the provider. But absolutely come with a list of expectations, come with questions, and be sure your cloud provider can provide the right answers. Sometimes the provider will have to say, I'll have to get back to you on that. But did they, right? Did they answer the question to your satisfaction? You cannot proceed until you are comfortable with the answers to those questions. And once you do that, and you've got that comfort factor and you've done your homework, cloud can be a great option for your IBMI. All right. Thank you for attending. Let's take a look at the questions here, see if we have any left. Okay. Size threshold. So one question is, do we have a size threshold for each method? Not really a formal one, but it's one of those, as we sit in our pre-sales teams and we talk about them, and sometimes we go, ooh, I don't think I would do that way with that much data, right? And that FTP thing we talked about, there's probably like 150 gig sort of limit on that at the low end, right? In other ones, Migrate While Active and Mimics could handle, very, very large, right? Because they have that ability to seed with the tape. So anything else that we didn't answer? Okay. I don't see any open questions there. What do we have, about another 5 minutes or so, Tom?
We do, yeah. Sorry, I just rejoined just to see if you needed any hand with those questions, but I think you did a great job, Larry, of answering them as we were going through. So thank you to you for that. If anyone has got any other questions, then now is a great opportunity to borrow one of the great minds. I can just see another one popped in there. How successful power provided from Azure, Google Cloud, I guess, and AWS?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, how successful are those guys at hosting IBMI? The big picture from as long as I've been in cloud, which is closing in on 15 years now, doing cloud things, is that those great big providers will do a fantastic job on having a building with security and power and cooling and space. And then it gets down to the operating system and they go, well, we gave you IBM Power. What else do you want? Right. And because they just don't have the skills for that. And if they do have skills, quite often they're multi-hatted skills, right? You got that hat rack in the corner. It says IBMI on one hat, and AIX on a hat, and Linux on a hat. So you're not going to get the level of IBMI support that you'll get from a cloud that brings to the table IBMI expertise directly. Okay, I don't see any other ones. So, yeah, it's IBM obviously has their cloud. There's lots of other competing clouds out there around the world. And just another thing to kind of mention is, as you look at geographic separation, these are things that people consider, or at least should consider with their cloud. United States is a big country geographically, not as big as Canada, for example. But there's different things that affect different geographies, right? One corner of the country, they've got volcanoes. Another corner has, hurricanes. I'm from Michigan. We get snowstorms, right? It turns out that data centers aren't all that perturbed by snowstorms, though, because when it's cold outside, it's easier to keep the data center cold. That's, reasonably good thing. And we have building codes that say roof must be able to support snow, right? Important, small important thing. So, but you definitely don't want to have your production and your HA, 30 miles down the road. We've even seen literally, and this was in New Orleans, production on one side of I-10 and HA on the other side of I-10. So if you remember a certain hurricane that came in, it flooded both sides of I-10. Oops. So some of those best laid plans weren't all the best plans, let's say. So those are definitely things to think of, but certain areas are just higher risk in general. So those areas tend to be less popular for cloud, let's say. But it was mentioned too that latency is a thing. And so where you are in the country, I used to joke with a friend of mine that was a popular speaker at Common for many, many years, and also from Michigan, that we want to build a HA data center in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Why do we want to do that? So we can spend time up there because it's a wonderful place. Okay. And to be fair, they virtually never get tornadoes. They get some thunderstorms. It gets cold. So what's not to love? The latency, because there's just not very much fiber up there, right? So that becomes an issue. Certainly no terrorists because everybody's walking around with a deer rifle. So that's not going to happen. But there's a lot there that you have to consider all these things, and the big providers aren't going to put a data center in Sault Ste. Marie. It's just not going to happen. But
okay. Well, if anyone in the audience does have any questions for Larry and they'd like to get them across to him, you can see that his details are on there. Or alternatively, you can carry on submitting them, and we'll pick them all up tomorrow afternoon for anyone in sort of the European region, or sort of late morning for anyone over in North America. Say a massive thank you to Larry for taking the time to do this. As always, great speaker, great content, and even got a few of your stories in there as well, which are always great to hear. We're going to go into a short 15-minute break now. So if you need to go refill those coffee cups, please do feel free. After that 15-minute break, there's going to be another 3 tracks to choose from. So just keep an eye on that landing page to see which session you'd like to join. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Larry, for speaking. And we hope to see you in the next session very soon.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.